this round. But before we begin, just a quick roll call for judges. So on panel A, which is my panel, do we have Rukaya?
Yes, Rukaya is here.
Great. And do we have Hennington?
Yes.
Awesome. And then panel B, I don't know who the chair is, but could they please just confirm that they're here and their panelists are here before we proceed?
Hi guys, I'm Susanna. I'll be the chair for panel B. Panel B panelists, please confirm you are here. Apili, Cynthia.
I don't know if you were speaking, but we could not hear you. Apili, Cynthia, but I'm gonna assume you're here. Okay, guys, so then team roll call. Do we have opening government?
So I don't like this.
Opening government? Okay, thank you. Opening opposition? Opening
I think it's
opposition?
next one.
Okay, closing government?
CG is here.
Closing opposition?
Yeah, closing opposition is here. James will be speaking second, and Raima Muhammad will be speaking first.
Yeah, please just drop that in the chat space so that we are able to have it for ballot purposes. Okay, again then, do we have OO here now? Opening opposition? Okay, I see LO just dropped. Okay, so yeah, with that, then I think everyone's here. And we can go ahead and start. So just quickly introductions. My name is Zestiana Hill, pronouns she. I'll be the chair judge for this round. And then, yeah, my other panelists can also introduce themselves if they'd like.
Okay, hey guys, my name is Annington. I'll be paneling this round on panel A.
Okay.
Yes,
That was completely optional. It's okay. I think we can just go ahead and start. We've delayed enough. So without any further ado, please make sure to apply standard BP rules. 7-minute speeches, 15-second POIs, no badgering speakers, and yeah, let's have a fun and respectful round. The Prime Minister can then begin their speech here. Prime Minister, you have the floor.
Sorry, just to check that.
Are you the Prime Minister?
Sorry, can anyone hear me? I don't know if this network is fine.
Yes, we can hear you. Are you the Prime Minister?
Yes, if I am the Prime Minister. If I wasn't Prime Minister, I probably would. Anyways,
Please,
yeah.
sorry, before you start your speech, could you please post your speaking order in the chat space so we know as well, or your deputy can do
I'm the
that.
Prime Minister. Is it fine for me to start?
I'm so sorry. You're
Okay.
cutting a bit.
Pastor, if you could. Okay. I'm just going to move around a bit and see if it helps. Am I more audible now? Huh. Okay,
We can
can
hear you,
anyone
but
hear me?
like, yeah, can you please just read out the motion for us in its entirety so we can confirm you're audible?
All right, this House opposes the increasing reliance on Chinese infrastructure loans by African governments.
Okay, you cut out towards the end. Just repeat that really quickly. Can one of my panelists just confirm that it's not just my connection? And
Oh, it's not just you. It's a
This
little
House opposes.
laggy.
I'm so sorry, Rookie, I didn't hear you. Did you say you can also not hear the speaker as well?
Yeah, I just said it was breaking a bit.
Oh, okay. Speaker, we can't hear you like clearly. So just maybe try and fix your connection and then like just tell us when you're ready. We'll give you like 1 minute. Did the speaker leave the call or? Okay, I think the speaker left the call. We're gonna, speaker, are you here? Prime Minister.
Sorry, I tried leaving and coming back. Can anyone hear me now?
We can hear you, speaker. Just quickly read out the motion so we can confirm you're audible. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. This House opposes the increasing reliance on Chinese infrastructure loans by African governments.
Okay, I think that's fine. If there are any issues, I will pause your time and inform you. Yeah, you can begin whenever you're ready.
Stressful. Uh, okay. Sorry, Chair, can you hear me now? I have tried everywhere in this room.
Speaker, you may begin your speech. Is the Deputy Prime
Serious,
Minister
I'm
on call
running out of
now?
options. Sorry?
I'm so sorry. Are you ironing this round or is your Deputy Prime Minister here on the call?
No, my
I'm on the
partner's on the
call.
call. If I'm off,
Okay, Speaker, if you are unable to give your speech, your deputy might have to iron because we're already way behind schedule. So you need to start your speech now or
I'll be
you
alive.
have to forfeit it to them.
let me try and start and let's see. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, speaker, please begin your speech.
Chair, am I audible?
Yes, speaker, please start your speech.
Hopefully it doesn't get messy in the middle of all of this. Apologies for the delay so far. And then if I get any bits of positive feedback, I will start. This House opposes the increasing reliance on Chinese infrastructure loans by African governments. Was that good?
Speaker, please start your speech.
Sure. All right, start. The first thing to consider here is the actual nature of how these loans happen. For one, they're often tied to high level and high key infrastructure, often things that these individuals do not necessarily need, but they're big projects that ultimately are more likely to attract this sort of funding. Secondly, the Chinese system of giving out loans is primarily focused on China. So what it looks like is that Chinese companies are going to have to handle the infrastructure, and people at the very highest level are going to be Chinese, and more often than not, it means that there's very little things like skill transfer or there's very little local involvement in all of this, besides already notorious for debt traps. So what it looks like is China gives you a loan that it knows you obviously cannot repay, and then uses it as a basis to then either financially or like in some other way exploit you. I think the most proximate example of this is China seizing key pieces of ordinarily national like resources like airports and the rest of these things because countries are able to pay their loans. But it's even worse because more often the political nature of the people who negotiate these deals means that they often have an incentive to prioritize gains to represent. There's four things we're going to do in this speech. Number one, we're going to talk about why this is necessarily bad in principle. Secondly, we're going to talk about why this is bad on a pragmatic level. So even in the best case scenario, this is bad. Three, why this exacerbates problems in Africa, like things like what they call it, corruption and irresponsible government spending. But finally, something of a counterfactor to show that there is a world where we move away from this reliance on them. So the first thing, China is already notorious for debt traps, how it gives its loans as a pretext for which it takes over either state resources like infrastructure or directly has access to things like direct mineral resources. The reason why this is problematic is that these mineral resources are often significantly more valuable than the loans for which they were secured. One. Two, Chinese companies, when they take over these resources and when they take over these areas, often access impunity and above government regulations. This is where you're likely to see things like the stratification of African states, where there are certain areas within African states where only Chinese people can come and Africans who actually own the land cannot get into. Within that, this level of classism is already very bad. But three, the lack of regulations often means that there is an overwhelming incentive for these Chinese companies and China's domination to treat African citizens within these regions very badly. So do things like underpay, do things like have very poor conditions of service, and these African countries are no longer able to do anything about because
Speaker,
it's
am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Speaker, I'm so sorry, but like I cannot hear every other word. You keep breaking. So your time was paused at 2 minutes and 18 seconds. Um, I would encourage you to just, I don't know, try something different in terms of your network connection to make it better so that we can hear you. Again, I'm going to give you 1 minute and then, yeah, you're going to have to continue.
Chair, I'm not sure where the issue is from because my partner said they could hear me fine. So I don't know if it's an issue from my end. I don't know if anyone else can hear me.
Okay,
This is the
speaker,
pan.
I think
Yeah, I
it's
don't
okay
know.
now. I think you can continue.
Okay, this is crazy.
Wait, so you can hear me now?
Excuse me?
Chair, other persons on the chat space say they can hear the speaker perfectly well, and I can also hear the speaker on my own end. So I'm really unsure whether it's probably your own network on your own end. So like probably the both of you guys can just leave the call and just come back or just switch networks. The speaker is fairly
No,
audible.
I just like to hear from my panel if they can hear the speaker like very coherently. That's what I would like to know. So, Rakaya and Hannington, could you please tell me if you could coherently hear the speaker?
I could hear him, but he did start breaking at some point. So
Hannington?
Okay. All right. So am I audible right now, Chair?
Okay,
Let's
speaker.
start with that.
Yes, speaker, you can just continue your speech. Your time was paused at 2 minutes and 18 seconds.
All right. What's the last thing you heard me say?
You were describing how it's bad for like African communities when the Chinese actors take over the resources and exert classism. You were talking about that.
All right. Okay. I'm going to resume right now. What this essentially creates is a renewed system of neocolonialism where Chinese actors are able to covertly and even directly, in some instances, take over completely national resources and control the people who exist within these regions. I think that this is primarily bad, especially given the colonial history of African nations and the huge amount of fights that was given to even get away from that. We think that not only is it wrong in have that sort of level of neocolonialism, but we think it's also wrong because of the specific history of Africa and the amount of fighting that went into like freeing Africans from those situations in the first place. Second thing to talk about here is things like skills transfer and controls of projects. So I already characterized how in the vast majority of these instances, the projects are entirely at the behest of China. So this means things like product deadlines, the ability to deliver and quality are all entirely at China's BS and at the control of these Chinese companies. The reason why this is bad is that local people rarely ever get benefits from this. This looks like having technology that only Chinese overlords can control, which like essentially broadens the problem of neocolonialism and means that African states barely ever benefit from these things, even in the best case scenario where this infrastructure existed perfectly without all the discrepancies that are obviously normal within African countries, including things like kickbacks and the rest of these things. My third thing to talk about here is that this increased and guaranteed funding likely impacts on things like what happens in a world with the increasing reliance is that you further entrench that ideology that there is always going to be a loan, particularly from people like China. That means that African nations have less incentive to do more prudent spending, or at the very least, politicians have less incentive to do so. The reason why this is bad in the long term is that you can only do it for so long. What this means is that it is more like resources, which means that the nations themselves suffer, even if they get one or two shiny projects every now and then. Fourth thing to talk about here is how this likely feeds into ideas like geopolitics. So what happens here is that a continued reliance on China likely alienates the US and other allies due to the nature of like global politics and the polarization that currently exists between East and West. What happens here is that African nations, but when these guys clash, it's unlikely that they clash with themselves, but it's more likely that they weaponize African states or weaponize things like extra-state actors funding revolutions or funding rebels within these regions to destabilize these African states that are likely to be more culturally or at least diplomatically aligned with China. This is significantly worse because it means that you lose out on lots of benefits, including historical benefits that would ordinarily be good for African nations. Last thing to talk about here is the obvious question, okay, fine, should we just borrow? And I think like that's a narrow way to look at it. what does our counterfactual look like? We imagine three things. The first one is government like expenditure cuts and changes in finances. African nations spend things like millions or billions on yachts and airplanes, stupid other things that they definitely don't need. But they're likely to keep taking these actions because they know that the money for the infrastructure that their people need will likely come from somewhere else. I think in a world where you're more likely to have those infrastructure, like where those loans don't exist or where you don't have that reliance, it's more likely the African states are likely to push for more like responsible government spending, which means that people don't suffer from these losses in the first place. One, but it also means that you're more likely to have a government that's functional and not beholden to anyone, because a system of constant reliance on Chinese loans means that you ultimately become a Chinese puppet. But second thing to talk about here is a diverse borrowing portfolio. So what this looks like is borrowing from different people using consolidated credits. So it means we might borrow a bit from the IMF, and we might borrow a bit from World Bank, and we might borrow a bit from OPEC, and we might borrow a bit from a couple of sovereign wealth funds. What happens here is because the amount of loans or lending that we have from each individual actor is small and likely tied to smaller things and smaller concessions, it's unlikely that we'd be making as huge concessions, including things like getting like what they call ceding resources or ceding significant parts of the national government and its operations. What this means is that we're likely to get the same expenditure loan, or maybe slightly less, and maybe at a bit more work, because obviously you have to talk to a lot of other people. We think that's still likely that you get the funds here side of our position. But that thing to talk about here as regards the counterfactual of diversified borrowing is things like internal borrowing. So I think some African nations are already experimenting things like this, like internal and local borrowing from local African companies, which are likely to have some amount of funds and are unlikely to have as much predatory practices behind them. But more importantly, borrowing from localized African institutions like the African Development Bank, which already exists, which is already providing loans to multiple other people, which are less likely to be predatory in the first place. Two, are more likely to recognize unique African conditions, which means loans are likely to be catered to those conditions in the first place. But three, are more likely to say are more likely to do things like debt forgiveness in the long term without necessarily causing such huge harms. Why is this ultimately better and more important? Because the essence of it is that we're able to change what the national priorities are and able to change how African nations look like without necessarily causing egregious harms on African citizens themselves. So it's unlikely you're going to have that stratification that exists with China. You're going to have people taking over like significant resources in a world where you have these sort of other borrowings, either because they don't have as much financial leverage on you in case of borrowing from multiple people, or because like they are people who are less likely to want to exercise that leverage, even if they had it, in the case of borrowing from like local African companies and borrowing from the ADB. Why is this reliance then bad in the long term? First thing to talk about. Oh, all right, that's calm. My partner will do the rest of the work, probably.
We thank the Prime Minister for their fine contributions. We now welcome the Leader of Opposition to open the opposition case. Hear, hear.
Just to confirm, am I audible?
Crystal clear, speaker. You may begin.
Okay, just a second and I will begin. And also, if you hear some background noise, kindly ignore. I'm actually at church and I had to step out to do this. Anyways, for POIs, from my third or fourth minute, you can always say POI and I'll take you. At any point is equally fine if it's clarity, but I'm sure that I'll do take you and that's not a problem at all. All right. I'll be starting then and if you don't hear me at any point, just let Supanana know. You'll get me back on the call. Okay, starting then in 3, 2, and 1. We are going to be arguing this debate on 3 specific levels. One, the context of increasing reliance, because of course I was thinking OG was going to be arguing this burden quite more better by highlighting the increase in reliance and why probably is the reason for them to oppose. And we would show you strategically why we still won't oppose within those spaces. Secondly, we are going to be arguing this on the context of China as the lender versus Western sources, and finally the context of infrastructure-focused loans. And you see, here's a clarity I need to make. OO says that these things are most likely things that African countries don't need. Panel, strike that out of your books, because the info slide specifically mentions examples of what these infrastructure-focused loans are, funding things like ports, railroads, roads, etc. All of these things are needed by every single country, whether they are developed or not. And so that general assertion that these are things that African countries don't need is a crazy one, and we don't think it's one that you should buy on any level within this debate. But I'm going to be arguing this debate specifically and doing this bidding that opening government ignores to do by showing you the first context of increasing reliance. Because the info slide says, first of all, that these African countries are constantly going into these spaces, which means that it's something that is continuous, it's a trend. I'm going to show you why, even within those spaces, we don't regret it and we don't think it's something we need to oppose. Because we say on our side that this is a developmental necessity and it's not just recklessness. And here's the simple explanation to this. You see, African countries or Africa in general faces a huge annual infrastructure financing gap. And so, for example, sources say that we need about 100 billion, 200 billion, 150 billion to be able to finance our infrastructure annually. But you see, here's where the trick comes in. Because domestic taxes, private investment, local borrowing cannot sustain this. It's largely insufficient annually to be able to deal with these things. That's why all the alternatives that they give you, like local borrowing from other African countries, really doesn't work. Because if that was the case, the ECOWAS Bank would have funded all other projects in Ghana, Nigeria, Liberia, and all of those countries. That is largely insufficient. But the next thing you need to identify here is that increase in reliance is not an addiction. It's actually strategic leveraging. Because what governments are using in African countries is that they are using those Chinese loans because the other options are probably too slow, too conditional, or too politically constraining. I'm going to show you why this in itself is strategic on three levels: economic, political, and developmental. Let's start with the economic, because you need to understand that domestic revenue and the foreign development investment cannot fill that gap. It means that by relying, you are creating a financing strategy. You are borrowing from who is accessible and where you can get large scale capital. And that's China. It means that the strategy they're using is really simple. They are using China's capital to unlock that growth and then reinvest that revenue in other places to be able to reduce their debt exposure. And you see that all over the world, in Ethiopia, in Kenya, and all of these spaces. But on a political level, we still think it's strategic because you see, when you rely on China within the context of the global space, you are getting a bargaining leverage within international finance. Because when you engage China, African states are signaling that they have alternatives beyond the Western institutions. And what that means is that beyond China, that diversification now allows them to negotiate even softer conditionalities and lower interest rates from others. And for example, when Ghana and Zambia engaged China, the Western lenders were more open to adjust their terms to remain more competitive with Africa, because now Africa is showing that we have other options that we can deal with. That's political sovereignty, giving them that bargaining power. But on a developmental level, you need to also understand the unique nature of these loans because they are asset based, which means that by relying, we are targeting productive debt, not just consumption, because these loans are funding tangible infrastructure. These things in turn expand our GDP, our trade corridors, power supply, and all of these things are there to enable future self-reliance. It means that though we are getting debt now, we are converting that into growth multipliers, and they are not just liabilities. And these are the things that show that we are growing at the end of the day. So it's more strategic and more huge than what opening government gives you at the end of the day. But you see, beyond that signaling, we still think it's important because we are restoring agency in a historical unequal financial order. For decades, our borrowing pattern has been monopolized by Western institutions like IMF and all of these institutions. We think that by moving on to these spaces, we show that we can create competitive financing by engaging China on all of those levels. But the second thing we also do is that we reinforce Africa's strategic relevance in global politics because the world is increasingly becoming multipolar, not just held by the United States and then the Western institutions. What this means is that when you are within that multipolar world, your influence has to follow infrastructure and finance. But when we borrow from China, Africa now embeds itself within that new axis of global development. We are connecting Asian markets, we are using African resources, and we are opening global trade corridors. It means that we position ourselves in a space that allows us to pivot between powers and we can shape things rather than being shaped by those global trends. This is uniquely important for us within those levels. But you see, let's look at the context of China in and of itself, because these guys say, well, at best, China is a predatory institution. And you see, panel, here's what I hate, especially when people engage debates by showing no proof. There's a lot of monopolization and influence, and there's a word I'm looking for, propaganda by Western institutions. John Hopkins research, it's a simple research you can Google to find out. The number of takeovers by Chinese institutions is very, very few. That Huge propaganda by the Western institutions making China look like a monopoly and an institution that just wants to take over all of these industries is one that we don't buy. We think that debt trap narrative is one that is overblown, because when you reject Chinese loans on those grounds, what you are in fact doing is that you are imposing a Western moral panic that denies Africans of their agency. But I'm going to argue in this also largely within the context of the infrastructure focused loans. And I'm going to show you why, even if we collateral our natural resources, we think that's a better institution to take. Don't worry, Stephen and I will take you. I'm so sorry. Let me argue this very last one. We think it's very important because when you use natural resources as a collateral, you allow African nations with low credit ratings. And you see, that's the good thing about engaging with China. When you engage with the IMF, a lot of African countries don't get the loans because they have low credit ratings, even though they have natural resources. And they can't engage because IMF criteria is very specific on your credit rating. But when you engage with China, you're able to collateral those natural resources to be able to still get those loans. It means that the Western institutions and alternatives leave you trapped in that debt and a perpetual level of not developing. But with China, you can collateralize these things and you can be able to get the benefits at the end of the day. But you see, let's assume that even Chinese institutions take over our natural resources. First of all, we say most of those natural resources in African countries are dead assets because they don't get to use them. They can't even mine them and they can't get these things to use. We say we are converting those dead assets into liquid capital. It means that even though we are resource rich, we don't get to use them, but now we can use that as leverage to get resources. But here's the honest truth. When Chinese take over your natural resources, in fact, it's definite, not indefinite. What that means is that the contract ends by then African countries are developed. They own these takeovers and resources and can still build from there. We think that's economically good. Ignore all the propaganda within this debate. Argue on an economic level, we win from opposition.
We thank the Leader of Opposition for their fine remarks. We now
And
welcome
I'm
the
sorry for
Deputy
not
Leader.
taking POIs. Super Nana would definitely take the POIs. I'm so sorry.
We welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to extend on government case.
Okay, Chair, am I audible?
You are audible, Speaker.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone on the call. The name is Aristotle. Let me just set up a timer and then I can start. You can just unmute once and be specific. So POI OO POI CO. So I know the team that I'm taking. Let me set up a timer. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. So, Chair, when you listen critically to leader of opposition, I think they already say they are within a church premises, and that's why their engagement with their counterfactual shows clearly they don't listen to Prime Minister. The major bulk of the counterfactual is three things. The first is private institutions or private individuals loaning the national government the money. And these are for instances where private individuals have epistemic access to capital. And right now in status quo, there are limited countries that have private individuals that can necessarily do this. And that's why the two other portions of the counterfactual becomes ultimately then important. He talks about the African Development Bank, which right now is getting lots of funding from most African countries. And the beautiful thing about the loans from African Development Bank is that it has zero to little interest rates. When you compare it, and this is fact, to Chinese loans, it's loans that come at a commercial rate, which means comparatively on their own side, you have to spend billions of dollars financing and servicing loans on their own side of the house, which means comparatively, the African Development Bank is a better alternative. But thirdly, we also talk about the instances where probably the African Development Bank don't have access to capital, which means then we can have things like consolidated loans where you get loans from different actors. The reason why this is ultimately then important within the round is because it allows you retain your sovereignty and allows you not to be beholden to a single creditor in the vast majority of instances. Their side, they can't force us to defend borrowing from Western institutions because that's not the narrative from opening government PM speech. Then allies when they, especially with their engagement on the counterfactual. Let's talk about other things then within the debate. Let's assume the best case scenario. And this is me doing literally their job for them. Let's assume that probably we do need all of those things. There are 5 reasons here why it can't
buy like Chinese loans as something that is ultimately important. The thing about Chinese loans is that it lumps African countries into a single basket and into a single sector segment. The problem here is that most African countries have different needs and different preferences that will ultimately make their citizens more economically viable. So for certain African countries, what they require is investment into things like fertilizers or into things like agriculture. I'm talking about countries like Sri Lanka and Lesotho in those sort of instances, which means on their own side, when you build things like infrastructure, I'm really unsure why that infrastructure is ultimately then important to individuals insofar as you don't have the existent local agriculture or manufacturing that will ultimately allow you to use those roads or those ports in those sort of instances. But secondly, things like ports, things like stadiums, all of those things may be important symbolically, but insofar as it doesn't create some level of pragmatic utility to individuals that exist within the grassroots, ultimately then the loan on their own side is net negative. Let's talk about other things then in terms of the comparative as to why their loans are terrible. I think the other thing here, why their loans are terrible, is because most of their loans in the vast I'll take your POI letter. Most of their loans in the vast majority of instances ultimately utilize Chinese citizens. I think the reason why the AFDB is ultimately better is because right now AFDB has loans for things like education, things like infrastructure, and in the vast majority of instances, insofar as the AFDB is not an independent state, they would require your citizens to do things like the building of those infrastructure, the building of those sort of like utilities that they want to ultimately create, which means at that particular point in time that you have the utilization of local skills. Comparatively on their own side, you have the importation of Chinese labor, which means ultimately that the repatriation happens on their own side, particularly to the Chinese government, and African countries doesn't get any sort of utility. But I also think they need to engage our case on technology, because we explain why most companies, like most Chinese software companies like Huawei, etc., that are investing right now within most African countries also ultimately use their citizens, which means that the increase in things like software development or probably access to technology doesn't materialize, which means at best their loan doesn't create any sort of utility. This is why our own side comparatively beats theirs in terms of the pragmatics. But let's talk about the principle here. I think the extension to the principle I would explain here is that if individuals existed under a system historically that ultimately took away their dignity and the ability to say no to certain individuals that probably had more epistemic access to capital, the only way in principle that you can ensure their sustainability is when you create a mechanism that doesn't allow future generations to be literally born into a world of debt. What happens on their own side, given that on either side of the house, on their own side of the house, when these things manifest, given the commercial rate that Chinese loans occur, it means that most individuals that get born into African countries get born into a situation where they're already born into a world of debt, and there is huge expectation from the national government to ultimately change their future. And given that the African government on their own side of the house necessarily have to service debt, it means that the capacity of those future generations to probably get access to better education is literally absent, because government necessarily has to do things like service debts, etc., etc. All of these things in principle means then that you mortgage the future of unborn children and future generations on their own side of the house. Before speaking any further, any POI, see you.
Yes, I wanted to ask, what is the likelihood of your counterfactual comparative to the fact that you already said that Africa has a huge demand?
Demand, like this is James, you shouldn't be doing this. If Africa has a huge demand, this is why our counterfactual is ultimately then robust. I literally told you about borrowing from private individuals when you are talking about countries like Ghana or probably South Africa or Nigeria that have access to private individuals that can provide this. But I also gave alternatives like the AFDB and consolidated loan. All of these things means that different African countries, regardless of their economic conditions, have different actors they can necessarily borrow. We don't want to condition ourselves to be dependent on China. That's the the comparative that you necessarily have to defend. Let's talk about then why our own side is ultimately better, and I will spend the remaining time like explaining the comparative. I think the first thing here is the dilution of things like influence. I think ultimately, if the analysis that Western institutions are terrible in terms of the way they try to monopolize power, the analysis also extends to China, and it's far much worse for two strategic reasons. The first is that the Chinese government is ultimately authoritarian and dictatorial, which means in the vast majority of instances, right now, in most African countries, they weaponize and support most authoritarian regimes. Probably Western countries are probably even going to democratize like institutions. But secondly, on their own side, it means that Chinese companies are very terrible insofar as the Chinese government ultimately is an unholy matrimony with their companies, which means at the point in time where even Chinese companies invest, particularly within Africa, it ultimately means then at that particular point that they control African resources and African demography. For all of these reasons, DPM.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for their fine remarks. We now welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition to extend opposition case.
Can you hear me? I'm audible. Hi guys, can you hear me?
GLO?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes,
Am I
you're
audible?
audible.
Okay. If I'm breaking, you can just put in the chat space and then I'll see. Yeah, put POS in the chat, please. I'll check it shortly. Guys, do I have to speak louder? Jonathan is telling me I have to speak louder because you can't hear me clear enough. Is it good?
Speaker, you may begin.
Okay, I'm gonna start on my next word in 3, 2, 1. Both the PM and the DPM say that we spend these loans on shit that we do not need. Jonathan already responds to this by letting you know that ports and airports and railways are things that we need. But just to be shameless, I'm going to give you several examples. Whenever it rains in Nigeria, Lagos is flooded because their governments are terrible. They don't build bridges for them. So if China would build about the third and fourth mainland bridges for Lagos, flooding is going to be stopped. Citizens are going to be better because not all of them can afford to live in estates where they are corrupt governments and A-list artists get to live. This benefits the people. DPM was lying. But also, if Nigeria exports crude oil, where the fuck do they pass the crude oil? Probably through the port. So if China would build you a port, this is something that would benefit you. But if Kenya and all of East Africa are outbreak exporters of coffee and beans, and Ghana exports cocoa along with Cote d'Ivoire. I don't know where you're going to pass these things, if not through the seaport and the airports, and that's literally what the loans are for. I don't know why this doesn't benefit the people, given that a politician will not be a cocoa farmer, but it's going to be the average working class person that would be a cocoa farmer. It means these guys are the ones that get to benefit if these Chinese contractors come and build these things. The first gate from opening government is a lie. You can strike that off your books. But the second thing they say is that these are debt trusts and that they're going to take over natural resources. Jonathan already tells you that this is not a bad thing, but I have better responses to this. Yeah. 3 levels. The first is that I think we need to understand how the takeover actually happens because I have an MBA I'm currently pursuing and I'm a chartered accountant. Here's how it works, right? Number one is that when a country cannot afford to pay, China would negotiate a debt restructuring. That means, for example, they would negotiate an extended maturity or lower interest rate. But then if the country still cannot pay, then it means then that the takeover would have to happen. But the takeover doesn't mean China would come and invade your country. It's literally a lease management term where basically the management of that asset, whether it's a bauxite mine or Uganda's airports that they took over, would basically be handed over to Chinese management, but it would still be operating under the laws of the host country. So, for example, if they take over your airport, the revenue from the airport is subject to Uganda's corporate tax. So the Chinese management will still have to pay the 20% corporate tax to Uganda anyways, even though they took over that particular asset. But the third way this works is that the takeover is often temporary because it's a lease management. That means we are talking about 50 years lease agreement. At worst, it's a 99-year period lease agreement. As long as they are able to manage the asset and recuperate the amount of money they give you to build the loan, they would hand the assets back over to you. But my second level of rebuttal, apart from giving you how it works, is to show you that the temporary control is not a bad thing. 2 ways. Number one, we think China is a better steward of control of these assets than African elites because many African governments mismanage state enterprises because the electricity and the water and the utility boards oftentimes run into losses because they appoint board of directors based off of political sentiment and political it's better for China to control these assets anyways. But number two, it means the citizens are likely going to benefit more because Nigeria is notoriously known for unstable electricity. Half the country is in darkness. So if Nigeria would control NEPA in Nigeria, if China would control NEPA in Nigeria, it would be way better than whatever their government is doing, which is very shitty. So I don't know how that doesn't benefit the citizens. It in fact benefits them. This is not a
Point of
bad thing.
information.
But get to this later. The third rebuttal is that strategic assets are not the sole deposit of a state's sovereignty. Just in case CG wants to run that bullshit idea that if you lose control of your bauxite mine, you've lost sovereignty. I don't know who trained you in debate. I don't know who taught you why that is a true thing. Two responses. Because number one, I think there is a parallel. Several European and American firms already manage African oil blocks and African telecommunications network and African banks. These are crucial parts of the economy, but you don't see OG and CG crying and saying they've lost their sovereignty, right? But number two, then I think strategic requirement in the world of global integration means that most countries are going to have to integrate with other countries in terms of technical knowledge and human resource. So it's perfectly fine if Chinese people are going to manage your bridge or your port or your airport because you fail to pay the loans. That doesn't mean you've lost sovereignty as long as you're the one that is in power, like calling the shots there. Let me respond to OG's weird counterfactual. They say their government is going to be more reliant because the leaders know that China isn't going to give them funds. Number one, this is forced causation. Corruption happens in Africa because of weak institutions and tribal leaders, not because they have access to Chinese capital. Because we know that African elites used to loot IMF money and donor grants and money from USAID like 20, 30 years ago before China started giving them loans. That means if they were corrupt before, I don't know how you can link the corruption to China giving them money. That's a very silly argument to make. But then number two, I think if you start these African governments of Chinese money anyways, they are going to make the corruption even worse because now what they are going to do is they would overtax their citizens and they're going to neglect things like education and healthcare because they need to go to Maldives with their side checks on vacation. African leaders have notoriously noted for that, especially in authoritarian countries where like the government passes from the president to their nephew, to their uncle, to their brother. It's going to be much worse. At least if China gives them 5 billion USD and they waste 3 billion USD, the 2 billion would be it would cushion the citizens. I don't know why the citizens have to suffer so much. What was the alternative then? They said they were going to borrow from IMF, OPEC, like private people. This is like so terrible because Jonathan told you that it's not going to be enough, but way better responses. Number one, I think this is worse because then it's going to be counterintuitive. Corrupt African leaders scared of like the ADB because they know that they can appoint political people to go to the board of directors of those internal banks. So they aren't scared to manage the resources well and pay back. Even if they don't pay back, we are all Africans, we are all one nation, like Ubuntu, don't stress me, I want to pay you back. Like more resource mismanagement, it doesn't make. And then they say, oh, you can borrow from private individuals. This is terrible. I don't think Nigeria should borrow from. I don't think you should borrow from one billionaire because then you are beholden to the whims and caprices of one person. Much worse. It's like so horrible. But that's from TG. TG, shoot.
Speaker, I want to ask you
I'm
whether or
sorry,
not
speaker,
American
protected time. Protected time. Please continue your speech, speaker.
Sorry, cool. Moving on
Your
then.
time was
What I'm
12
going to
at
then
6
do.
minutes, 10 seconds. Oh, sorry. Yeah, continue.
Okay, all right. What I'm then going to do is to show you that we think that the Chinese loans are way more preferable, given that we recognize that we have corrupt African leaders. Panel note, right? The info slide tells you that when China gives you the loan, they send their own contractors to be the one to build these particular things. This is very important to note because then the counterfactual is that these African governments would take the IMF loans and the ADB loans, and then they'll probably not even launch the assets anyways. But at least with the Chinese loans, they would build the assets. That means the citizens get to benefit, and the government is the one that worries about repayments. This is important because the period of building that asset is what defines life or death for some of these people that are dependent. So, for example, if you construct the bridge, street sellers are able to go there and hawk to the people in traffic, be able to make a living, given that these governments don't care about them anyways. This is very important because then they get to survive day in and day out. But the only thing you can take from opening a position that if the governments are as terrible as OG and CG says, then we think we need a very austere lender that can put some kind of like fear into them because it's largely unpopular for these African leaders to tell their electorates that, hey, I'm giving out control of our ports to China. They might want to rethink it because they want to be popular with the people and they might likely manage the resources a little bit better. It's a win-win for everybody. China all day, here.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for extension and the close of the first half. We now welcome the member of government to continue the back half of this debate. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Okay. I'm just getting my timer. If that's not gonna bump it. Okay. I'm gonna begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. When Britain, France, and the colonial powers during the most colonial times were losing power, the Africa turned to America, an isolationist state which reached out a hand of assistance. It took a certain amount of time for things to go bad, but they went bad inevitably. Because reliance never works, particularly in the long term, and is unstrategic, in spite of what opening opposition tells you. The first thing, and in which I'm going to do in this speech, is a little bit of rebuttal, right? I'm going to engage opening opposition directly on some of their most ludicrous claims. The first is that they tell you that African politicians want to be popular, and consequently they won't let China just seize land. Okay, if that's just like the case and that's going to fix everything, then African leaders wouldn't default on any loans. That's just a ridiculous claim. The second thing that's problematic is like, but also the reason that doesn't happen is because they default because they don't have finance to pay it back. That's still a problem in their world. The second thing is that they say that their alternative, like the reason why we shouldn't we should switch to this Chinese alternative is because it's okay for them to take shit over, because them taking shit over is going to be less corrupt than African leaders. Think about how morally bankrupt that is. If that's the case, then we might as well just not give any loans to Africa in the first place, not elect any African officials, because they're just too corrupt to run anything. The third thing, they tell us that they want integration, and integration is good. We concur. We don't want reliance, and we think that it's their burden on opposition side to prove reliance to us, and that's why they're going to lose this debate. The alternative is a thing of diversity and a thing of a far better world where you're opting for loans from diverse sources. And I'm going to show you then why we win this debate and how we enter. First, a little bit of contextualization. We concur that increasing reliance on their side of the house means increased Chinese loans. It means less and less American loans, less and less European loans, less African loans. The third thing is that it means that African finance just stops happening because you start turning to that foreign alternative, and we stop putting funding into the African bank and things like that. The second thing that's important for us to contextualize is China, because that hasn't been done at all in this debate, right? China is fundamentally a self-preserving state. Don't let them lie to you. It's a fact. Look at Taiwan, look at Hong Kong, look at border disputes with India, right? These guys are trying to increase their influence in the world like any other nation, and that's particularly problematic. But secondly, intuitively, they have their own people. That's who they prioritize. They have their own interests. They have their own economy. That means that their loans cater to those people and those individuals and not African states, because they're not just some benevolence. The third thing that's important is what these loans look like. Now, importantly, we're going to contrast what alternatives are, right? If you look at the IMF and the World Bank, they're not like China. They're not a nation. The reason why that's so important is because they're made up of differing views of differing individuals who want to give loans for different reasons. That means there's contest and there's competition. That's important. You don't get that with China. Secondly, it's that there are conditions in Chinese loans. They try to tell us that the conditions on Chinese loans are nicer. That's their case. Realize, importantly, and this was going to be my POI, that the reason these conditions are nicer is because China is in a position to currently give you better conditions. Chinese incentives change over time like any other nation. The point at which American conditions got worse, not taken, is when America started needing to isolate, when their economies started needing more and more development in those areas, and that they needed to increase the kinds of conditions which they imposed in order to benefit themselves. China is subject to those same conditions and that same dynamism that prioritizes their own people. The reason they lose then is that their case only exists in the instance where we look at China now in the short term, the next 5 years, the next 3 years. If we look at the long term, their case completely collapses. The second second thing that's important then is now onto my substantive, right? I'm going to talk three things. We're going to give you three things from closing government. The first is why Chinese reliance is bad. The second is why they present us a false dichotomy that's fundamentally worse. And thirdly, I'm going to give you a little bit of rebuttal and extension. Cool. So first, onto my extension. It's that Chinese reliance is bad. It's not just because they take your shit, like opening government tells you, but it's also because reliance has always been bad. Like I alluded to earlier, if you're increasing your reliance on a state, it looks like us increasing our reliance on the West, right? As the West got more isolationist, they started to pull their things, right? Let's look at why China is likely to do this. Three reasons. Number one, they have population decline. Number two, they have stagnation in their economy currently because they're having less growth than ever. But number three, it's that loans are not forever, right? It's that these people are going to change their incentives to grow their own economies, which means that in the long term, you're going to likely get worse conditions in Africa when you rely. But secondly, is that neocolonialism is particularly worse than the alternative. Why? Because, from Chinese loans specifically, is particularly worse than the alternative. Why? Number one, you're less skeptical of these Chinese loans. All you have to do to believe this is look at the norms that are pushed from the opposition bench, right? That is, you're less skeptical because you have status quo bias of the West as the enemy and the West as the problem. We concur that they are a problem, but we don't concur that there isn't neocolonialism from the East, and you actively subjugate your people to that when you aren't as skeptical. Secondly, is that the IMF has more regulation. There's been more time and more critique for us to regulate the IMF and the World Bank than China specifically. China has total monopoly over how those conditions look in the long term and short term, very problematic. But thirdly, they're not a country, so it's worse. The reason why these things are so important is because they're not subject to just the idea of them taking your shit, which is the only thing which opening opposition responds to, but they're subject to the conditions which fundamentalize the existence of a nation, particularly in the long term. Third point of substantive then is going to be on the false dichotomy. But before that, I'll take you, James.
Yeah, like, hey man, like neocolonialism, yes, but what's the neocolonialism? At best, it's only hierarchical. You still get jobs for lots of people.
Cool. The reason why this is rubbish is because of the counterfactual which I'm presenting, which is that James and the whole of opposition bench relies on a false dichotomy between the West and China. This is fundamentally problematic. Two things that I'm going to talk here. Number one, that African finance growth is something that's fundamentally good and we get more of it. Why? The reason we get more of it is and I'll claim more sensibly, isn't what opening government is saying, which is that we're just going to rely holistically on the African bank. No, but that we're going to increase our reliance on that African bank instead of increasing our reliance on China. The reason why this is so fundamentally important is two reasons. Number one is that African bank relies on the cooperation of African states within Africa in order to grow, which means that it has to, in order to continue to finance, which means it relies on African stability. So African countries increase their cooperation. But second is that China has reverse and opposite alternatives. Incentives. China's incentives are to keep people divided so that they continue to perpetuate reliance, so that they continue to finance, which means they continue to benefit off of these loans. These incentive structures don't exist with African banks. But thirdly, in the worst case, we get more diverse portfolio than they do. Good for two reasons, an extension from opening, which is number one, that we get more competition, so better deals, not just that we negotiate better, but number two, there's less shock value from relying. Closing government wins this debate because we're congruent with reality and we don't rely on Chinese bullshit. We don't neocolonize states for the long term.
We thank the member of government for their fine contributions. We now welcome the leader of opposition, the member of opposition to continue and extend on opposition bench. Hear, hear.
Can I be heard?
You're audible, speaker.
Okay, so I'll be taking my points of information in the 5th minute. Please don't budge me anytime before. Okay, if you hear any background noise, don't mind. Okay. So I'm assuming I'm still audible.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Before Chinese financing, Africans' options were limited almost exclusively to Western institutions. African states were forced to accept terms that prioritize foreign agendas over domestic development. Important to note, this reduced the geopolitical position of African states. This is something that is bad, but also secondly, it was not able to help those African states develop. Two key burdens within our speeches today. Firstly, we're going to show you why we support those loans and why, secondly, they lead to more development to those African states in the long run. There are two key options that you have as an African state if you don't go to China to borrow. That is my first key term within characterization. Firstly, you rely on the West. Why is this something that is bad? Firstly, you don't get these loans within the long run. Why is this true? We have to note that right now within the West, there's a right-wing populism agenda that's happening. That is to say, the West is shifting towards protectionist policies. You see things like anti-liberation policies in the United Kingdom. You see that they are trying to reduce government spending in the vast majority of instances to be able to protect the citizens and whatnot. Or secondly, because citizens feel that those are things that are bad. This simply means that you're not going to be able to get those loans from those specific actors. Secondly, even when you get those loans, there are worse concessions that you get from those countries. Let's talk about comparative within this case. Firstly, when you look at France within West Africa, you saw things like it taking gold from these individuals, but also secondly, a lot of African countries' currencies were pegged to France. This led to underdevelopment of those countries. Why is the comparative better, which is our side? When you have China, it's just China bringing individuals within your country to be able to carry out these things, but also secondly, China sort of having a level of collateral. But notice, China never takes those resources away from you within the long run. That simply means China becomes a better option. Secondly, the other alternative you probably have as Africa is to get loans from places like IMF and the World Bank. We think that this is worse because of two specific things. One, you have to note that the IMF has things like structured advancement programs for African countries. This is something that is bad because one, they are forced to reduce government spending. Reducing government spending looks like things like reducing healthcare spending and whatnot. This becomes problematic for you as an African state. But also secondly, there's a loss of sovereignty because you're over depending on countries within the West, which are very harmful in the long run. This implies two specific things within this debate. One, on either side, there is a harm that happens. This debate is about which harm is worse, but also secondly, which side of the house is able to give you more benefits. Note that dependency exists on both sides of the house. We just have to prove why that dependency isn't as big on our side of the house. But also, secondly, I want to take your point of information. Even if OG says that private individuals and African banks are going to give these individuals those sorts of loans and it's going to be good for them. Two specific things here. One, private individuals and domestic banks lack the skill and the patience for infrastructure development. Note that infrastructure development takes a very long time, and the only way the only way things can happen within the society is through infrastructure development. The only way this sort of country can grow is through things like infrastructure development and whatnot. We have to note that private individuals within this case aren't going to be able to give you the money that you need as an African state to grow. But also, secondly, they have short-term lending markets in the vast majority of instances. 20 years for you to grow your infrastructure isn't going to be enough. At that point, you're never able to accrue benefits. But also, secondly, we have to note that African banks are constrained by debt in the vast majority of instances. You have to note that in most circumstances, you're never ever going to get what is going to help you benefit as an African country. That means that even their other alternative can't work with the vast majority of instances. CO says that relying is something that is bad. We have to note that reliance happens on both sides of the house in the vast majority of instances. That can't be a contention. They needed more analysis to show why it is something that bad. Moving on to our positive matter, we're going to show you two specific things. One, we're able to improve economies. Secondly, why development is then first on our side of the house, but also thirdly, why it's strategically good in the vast majority of instances. One, where we're able to improve the economy. We have to note that a large scale of OO's case is on why it is good. Let us show you how it specifically works. Two specific things here. One, we're able to improve the GDP of these specific countries, but also secondly, we're able to reduce the unemployment rates of these countries. Three mechanisms here. One, we have to note that infrastructure directly expands national productivity. We have to note that before Chinese engagement, African economies lost billions of dollars due to poor logistics, but also secondly, due to limited energy access and insufficient trade. Secondly, we have to note that Chinese loans directly target these structural barriers. What do they look like? The infrastructure programs that you have in your country that looks like the lack of roads in the vast majority of instances. Secondly, we have to note that employment is created. Why? Because these infrastructure projects absorb the massive local labor market, which is good in the vast majority of instances. But also, secondly, you can have your business economies like stimulated in the long run. Thirdly, we have to know that Chinese are actually better to give you tech access and green transitioning, which is good for you as an African country. We have to know that the world is moving towards climate consciousness and whatnot. We think that when you rely on China and whatnot, it then gives you a better position for this. What benefits do you get as an African country? One, not only are you able to remove the unemployment, but also secondly, you're able to get a better GDP, which puts you in a better position. Not on their side of the house, the alternatives are never able to work because one, they might probably not get these loans, but also secondly, these loans are tied down to high leverage, like give these American countries high leverage and whatnot. But also thirdly, even when you try to go for things like African development banks and whatnot, you never get that money that is going to enable you grow because these banks don't have the sufficient income. I'll take a point of information. Okay. 3,
Speaker,
2, 1.
recognize that what you need to
Protected
defend
time.
on your side of the house is reliance. What we need to defend is an increase in
So
diversity.
sorry, speaker. So sorry, speaker. Protect the time.
Moving on, secondly, we have to note that African governments are then put at a geopolitical advantage. The thesis here is very simple. China's rapid growth provides a strategic opportunity for these African countries. This is very simple. The logic here is very simple. At a point where you peg yourself to someone who's growing rapidly, that puts you at a better position within different things that happen within the countries or within geopolitics. That means that you're going to be at a better economic advantage. We have to note that in recent trends, Western countries have been falling and China has been growing. At a point where African countries continue to rely on them, one, they're able to position themselves very well geopolitically, which is good for them. What is the conclusion here? Two things. One, we're able to get massive infrastructure development and economic development, which becomes good for these African countries. Secondly, the alternatives are worse. When you don't rely on China, you get worse, which then makes it problematic for you as an African state. Geopolitical advantage. I rest my case.
We thank the member of opposition for their final remarks. Speakers, please be encouraged to take POIs. However, if you do recognize that you only have like 5 seconds before protected time starts, don't accept a POI because at that point you're just sort of being disingenuous to your own time because the panel can't consider it because it will be invalid. So make sure you have a minimum of 15 seconds between like you accepting the POI and the start of your protected time so that you can get the full POI asked. Thank you. Without any further ado, we welcome then the government whip to summarize government bench in its entirety. Here.
Can everybody hear me?
You're audible, speaker.
Alrighty, that's really brilliant. Then I'm gonna start in 3, 2, 1. The biggest issue with opposition bench as a whole is that they don't seem to differentiate the term between reliance and China's loans existing in the first place. They equally don't seem to understand the difference between diversity in different loans and particularly hedging everything against one specific nation. But let me start with a little bit of rebuilding from what Cheyenne said, and then I'm going to get into OO because they were the better team on the bench, and then eventually I'll get to CO and why we way above on the bench comparative. All right. Firstly, what they tell us is this idea of like private individuals not being able to tell us. One, we don't necessarily think this is going to be true, particularly because we didn't even argue it. I don't want the panel conflating this as something that we did. But then two, they tell us China's able to bring jobs and they're able to bring the creation of jobs. And so this is inherently better. Two responses. One, we never said that we don't want loans. We've equally never said that there isn't going to be a world in which the infrastructure is still going to be built because you're still going to have things like the IMF, like the World Bank, like some degree of China's loans, like some degree of Western influence over it. And so it's likely that these things are still going to happen in the very first place. Cool. The next thing that they tell us is that reliance is always going to happen. And because reliance is always going to happen, we should choose Chinese reliance over Western reliance. This isn't true. We've already given you several mechanisms as to...
Nix,
Yes?
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Please, I paused your time as well. Member of CAP, please mute your mic. Eziel Johnson. Thank you. I'm so sorry. Nix, you may continue. I stopped your time at 1 minute and 14 seconds.
Oh, all right. That's brilliant. Then I'm going to restart in 3, 2, 1. So what they tell us is that reliance is always going to happen. This is fundamentally untrue because you're unlikely to ever get a world in which you solely have to rely on one nation unless you particularly hedge yourself against one nation. There's a couple ways in which it's unlikely that Cheyenne has already told you, by the way, that the West is going to be able to do this. One, because again, Chinese loans still exist in this world, but two, there are several like Western countries, right? You're not hedging yourself against America. You're not hedging yourself with the UK or with France. You're doing a combination of all, which allows them to have less reliance on one particular country, but also allows them to be able to diversify their portfolios and to not have one country have as much control over what goes on in their own very country. Cool. There's also like institutions like the IMF, and there's a lot more regulations on the West because historically we know that they've done bad things, and so we're less trusting of them in a way that we're just not less trusting of China, regardless of them still following the pattern that Western influence and American influence particularly did when they first started doing it, and that equally getting us into a situation where we're still where we are, right? There hasn't been significant amounts of progress with that. Cool. Alrighty, let's touch on OO now. Cool. So OO tells us a couple things. The first thing that they tell us is that there's a need for infrastructure and money. Completely agree. However, we're not talking about the need of infrastructure. We're not talking about the need of money. You do need large amounts of money. There are other places that you can get large amounts of money because you can go to places like the African Bank. But to extend on our open, you don't just have to go to the African Bank. You can also go to the IMF. You can also go to several different places which protect your long-term incentives because you're less likely to be solely reliant on one country, which means you're less likely to be screwed over in the instance that that country can't provide anymore or that the economic situation in that country changes. You're also less likely to have them directly influencing everything in your government and being neo-colonial because there's more instances in which there's other countries and they actively have to compete for who's better and who has the least coercive loans possible, even if to some degree they're always going to be a little bit coercive. Okay, cool. The next thing that they tell us is that like you can always continue to use China. This is a blatant lie. If you're building reliance on China, that does not mean China is building reliance on you. China does not need you financially in the same way because China does not need you to be financially for them in the same way. If the economic situation or if the economic situation in China gets worse, they can choose to pull out, and you have no other mechanisms or no other means to be able to turn to because you're unable to ever escape that, and you've now cut off ties with everybody else. The next thing that they tell us within this point is like that you should choose to continue to use China because it's a shift away from the West. Again, it's this chat of this false dichotomy which keeps being brought up. I'll take you a little bit later, which is just untrue because you're allowed to use both. The next thing that they tell us is that debt traps don't exist. This is fundamentally untrue, but even if debt traps exist in the West to a certain degree, we still have more protection from the West because you have companies like the IMF and stuff who have regulation on it, and because the World Bank and the IMF aren't necessarily tied to one country the same way China is a country in itself and can rule over like other countries and that sovereignty. On this conclusion, we win on intensity of the harms that you're now creating in case China pulls away and within their rights to sovereignty and on the principal chat against neocolonials. Cool. The next thing that they tell us is about like definite versus indefinite harms and that China is going to be indefinite in nature, right? Untrue, because the nature of building reliance system like implies that you're going to try to have as long-term reliance. If you keep relying on them, you're going to keep needing them, right? Like that's logically going to be true. Cool. Then the next thing is, under this point, they talk about how temporary control isn't that bad because African leaders are inherently corrupt. We think this is incredibly disingenuous to like a continent and just a little bit racist, because why do you think that African leaders particularly are unable to do this? But also because even if they are going to be like inherently biased and inherently like coercive and corrupt, it's unlikely that they're going to not be corrupt on the side that it's China giving them the loans, because either way there's still going to be some oversight, and because there's going to be some oversight, it's an inexclusive harm. Cool. That's why we win again on the intensity of the harm of it being a definite sovereignty struggle, and also on the principle of we don't want them to be neo-colonial. Cool. The next chat that they tell us is that like sovereignty doesn't necessarily matter, right? And because sovereignty doesn't matter, matter, that we shouldn't value it because having control over certain things isn't necessarily bad. Again, logically, this cannot make sense because if sovereignty didn't matter, then why do we have a problem with them being indefinite in the West, right? Clearly, to some degree, we think indefinite control or control at all over these resources does fringe on your sovereignty and does conclude as colonialism. Several colonial countries also only ruled particular resources. They still had complete control because those industries are what powered the country in the very first place. It's incredibly disingenuous to say this, but why do we win on a bench comparative over and above that? One, we see that like OG tells us that they're like exploitative, colonial, and authoritarian from the side of China. However, they never tell us why this is and how it is, what China looks like, how the West is better. And so we win on an analytical extension here. Nextly, Cheyenne is able to tell you why we have long-term benefits. So we win on an extension here. I think we obviously have a rebuttal extension because, yeah, but also we're the only ones able to prove the false dichotomy and the way in which we're able to get both Chinese and we're able to get both Western, IMF, global African banks all to work together to be able to create the best future, and why we don't necessarily want to do what has previously been done because historically, logically, it hasn't gotten us anywhere. Why would we continue it? Thank you. No team, but OCG can win.
We thank the Government Whip for their fine remarks. We now welcome the Chief Whip to summarize this debate in its entirety. Here.
Hi, indeed, here. I really hope you can hear and see me. Yeah, people, we've been called trash, we've been called rubbish, shame. Let's see. But if you have a POI, just don't ask. Since everyone's being hostile in this debate, so don't ask. I'll ask for it, but I will be charitable. Just give me a second. I just need to make sure the way I'm reading these notes I typed is the way they are. All right. Panel, I'm going to start the speech in 3, 2, 1, go. There are 3 goals for me in this speech. 1, to prove to you where we beat both government teams, especially in terms of responses, which I will be providing. But I do think Rhyme already gives significant responses. So I think the first response that we really shouldn't buy from government teams and Shiana and Nix is, we can use the IMF. Rhyme already analyzes to you why the IMF implementing structural adjustment programs, which happened in about the 1990s, was bad, particularly because it emphasized that developing countries had to reduce their spending. This is important because she doesn't engage the fact that the spending for African countries is very, very crucial, because that's how literally you give welfare packages to people. This is why you were able to actually overcome like disasters within your countries because they are prone to those disasters. I don't think this is something that can win them this debate. But the second thing I will do is I will explain to you why Rhymer's extension is able to win this debate regardless of the response that I give you. Let's start with PM. PM's huge part is that a lot of these projects are tied to have Chinese high-level employment. I want to be very clear here. How do infrastructure development programs happen? This is to say, the conditions that Nix and CG want to push forward happen that 1, you're able to get like the high engineers at the top, right? This is important because I think one thing government teams don't analyze is that DPM says, we're going to make African governments more responsible. There is no explanation as to why African governments are going to be more responsible. Because I want to note, panel, that what is symmetric on both sides of the world, that corruption is happening on both sides of the world. So the crucial factor is which side of the world, whatever financing you're able to give, is able to mitigate that significantly. I would argue that when we have Chinese individuals at the top of the infrastructure, at the top being the managers, being the engineers, it is much better. Why? They have a higher accountability mechanism threshold to the Chinese government. Why? The Chinese government wants to keep it optics. I would argue that comparatively, Rhymer's argument comes in here. Rhymer explains to you that infrastructure programs by the virtue of them are large. That means to say, when you're building a road, you require raw materials, you require water, you require land, you require porters, you require labor, you require cars. I want to note that this is all contributed by African governments and African states. This is where the unique extension of employment comes in from Rhymer's speech, and that is why we're able to win there. But the second response I have for them is that they say that, you are much more likely going to do internal borrowing. But let's literally be realistic here. CG and OG concede to the fact that these programs are large. They needed to provide a probable counterfactual that makes that, and I'm going to do the likelihood analysis. But I want to note that internal borrowing is just never going to happen. Why? A lot of internal borrowing relies on the fact that you have rich individuals who are wealthy. Half these people invest and have capital flight and take their money outside. But even if that's not the case, they, like literally the African Bank and literally like ECOWAS don't have this kind of money. Why? They've even literally failed to stop military coups. ECOWAS had to rely on the fact that France was providing them resources to deal with the military coups in Mali and Burkina Faso. This is true because of the scale of this project, and that is what you really need to remember when you're weighing this debate in deliberation. Scale is important, and on virtue of scale, no government team has proved to us the scale. I think maybe OG does try, but they don't give us the scale to which you're able to acquire the resources that are going to benefit these people. Second, this whole geopolitical chart. But before that, I want to analyze the counterfactors. Because see, panel, in every debate, there are lots of counterfactors. What is the difference here? The counterfactor on their side is likely one where you're going to go to the West. Why? I already proved to you that you don't have that money. But most importantly, where do you get that money? From the West. I want to note that it's just such a lie when these people say that, like, oh, the US is accountable. Like, who killed Patrice Lumumba? Who killed African nationalists who were climbing up? I want to note that it's the people who hate the IMF. Because even if you look at the IMF doesn't have money right now. Literally, the USA and Donald Trump pulled out, which are their biggest funders. So what are you going to say now? So this is important because they had to actually analyze and explain to us how you get the specific things. But I think the second thing I really want to argue here is they have this whole chart about like China authoritarianism. Panel, I want to note that China authoritarianism is bad, but note it is a stable method. I want to note that you are able to understand how China is going to react because it is authoritarian. The comparative is not true. Why? The comparative is the IMF, which is now losing buy-in. The comparative is why you look in internal borrowing, which is never going to exist, particularly because you have political instabilities in all of these developing countries. This is important because you want stability. That's what African countries require. And when you do the comparative, China and how it reacts is much more stable comparative to all the individuals who want to be much more speculative. I don't think they're able to win on that. Thirdly, neocolonialism. Panel, I want to be very clear here. They never explain to you what type of neocolonialism we're looking at here. Because neocolonialism is symmetric. This is why when I'm doing the whole analysis as to why they are more likely going to have higher leaders, but the people at the bottom are people from your country, that's important analysis. Because that analysis shows that no side in this debate can genuinely win neocolonialism, but at least we can sway that to a bit of our instances. I'm not going to take you CG. You guys saying we're rubbish. I'm going to take OG now. OG.
If individuals in status quo have little ability to control nation states, isn't it better for you to stick with AFDB that are less likely to be dictatorial and manipulate your preferences insofar as the United States?
This is the conflation. This conflates that by virtue of China giving us the loan, they're now going to take over our government. That's not what happens. They take over specific resources that you co-signed when you are making that loan. You had to prove the link. You can't try to prove the link in the POI right now. You didn't prove that link. But I think the second thing, and I really want to respond to CG. CG claimed that, oh, you are much more likely going to create this whole stability. I want to note that one, the structural adjustment response from Reimer is important. Like Nick says that, oh, China doesn't need us. I want to be very clear here. They do need us. Why? China currently is the leading developer in technology. This is crucial because it requires minerals like cobalt. Who has those minerals? African countries. This is why they require us, because they require us to be able to surpass the USA in this whole like fight for who's going to be at the top. It's already protected time. I'm not going to take you. This is important because it shows that they actively need us. What have I been able to prove to you here? One, OG is lying to us because in a vast majority of instances, they don't explain to us how they overcome the issue. They overcome the issue of things like corruption. I would note that even if in the short run we have issues, even if in the short run we have a problem, in the long run it's much more better. Note, African countries require to help things like poverty. They require things like they require to create jobs. At the point at which you enable them create jobs, the problem with government teams is at no point do they give you mechanization to prove to you how these conditions are particularly persuasive, how these conditions become bad. The chat about sovereignty is just a lie panel. Like, it's not like because you give us a loan, you're not going to come and take over our government. Why does Reimer's extension win? Reimer is very clear. She explains to you how you better unemployment. Unemployment is crucial because it is what a lot of African countries struggle from. But secondly, she explains to you why the alternative is bad. Pando, the likelihood the comparative that is likely on government teams is not a comparative where you borrow from internally, because that money is never enough. The likelihood is where you go outside. And even if you borrow from inside, you reduce the sample space, which means African leaders are much more likely going to be corrupt. I want to note that we win this debate clearly. Why? We benefit things like unemployment, because this is a crucial factor within a lot of these countries, but most importantly, we show you the alternative is bad. Yeah, I read about it.
We thank the chief whip for their final remarks. Thank you guys for the debate. The panelists will now move to the discussion rooms A and B to come up with a call. And yeah.
you.